Rising from the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples went out to the Mount of Olives. They went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. It was there upon his arrest that Jesus was deserted by everyone. It had been a bad night already, but it was about to get even worse. This morning we shall see Jesus defamed yet devoted. And so I invite you to turn in your copy of God's Word to Mark chapter 14, continuing the story. It's a sinister tactic as old as the world itself. If you can't destroy someone with the truth, destroy them with lies. Some years ago, I would have said that the greatest sin in our nation was idolatry or lust or greed. However, today I would say that our nation's greatest sin is slander. From national politics to hallway conversations to social media, slander is the subtle, insidious sin of our time. Slander occurs whenever someone says something untrue about someone that results intentionally or unintentionally in damaging that other person's reputation. And when it occurs, it often affects numerous people. We're so conditioned to slander that we often don't even realize that we're doing it. When we pass along a damaging social media post without checking its factuality, we're committing slander. When we spread hurtful gossip about a person without finding out the truth, we commit slander. Even prayer concerns can become slander when shared in a way that could hurt a person's reputation. Even though we may not realize that we are committing slander or think our gossip is just harmless fun, ignorance is no excuse because slander is sinister sin. Proverbs 6 tells us that God hates slander. He abhors a lying tongue and a witness who pours out lies. And since God hates slander in Romans chapter 1 verse 30, Paul lists slander as a behavior of a person who actually hates God himself. Slander is incredibly destructive. It damages people. It hurts causes. It destroys churches. And Proverbs 11 verse 9 says this sin of the tongue, quote, destroys neighbors. And Proverbs 16:28 says it, quote, separates close friends. That's why slander is called a blasphemous sin. Slander defames a person's character. To defame means to defame. Remove the fame of a person. To defame is to damage the otherwise good reputation of a person with lies about that person. Sometimes defamation happens when a complete lie is stated as truth. More often, however, defamation occurs when lies are created from twisted truth, either misquotes or half-truths or misunderstandings or things like that. If you've ever suffered at the hands of a slanderer, you know that it is painful. And as I've said many times, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me is actually a lie. Because the bruises and breaks of sticks and stones will eventually heal, but the slanderous remarks that hurt your heart and your public reputation often do not. Often, once the lie is in people's minds, it is just there, and they often wonder, was it true? It can never be taken back. Yet, as sinister a sin as slander, there is one thing that is far more powerful, and that is the truth. The truth conquers all. The truth will always overcome. Maybe not immediately, but definitely eventually. When the truth comes to light, the slanderer will be revealed as lies, and the slanderer will be revealed as a fool. Proverbs 10:18 says the person who, quote, spreads slander is a fool. And Proverbs 30 verse 10 says the slanderer will have to pay for his sin. Now, because of its poisonous power, slander is one of Satan's chief strategies to divide relationships and to deter and derail the mission of the church. Therefore, it is no surprise that slander and defamation were at the very center of the evil workings of the night that Jesus was arrested and went to the cross. Today, we will see Jesus defamed with vicious lies, with fearful placation, and with mocking jest. We pick up the story where we left it last week, which is with Jesus' trial. Now, when we harmonize all four Gospels together, we see two trials of Jesus, each with three separate parts. And there was a religious trial before the Jewish religious authorities, and there was a political trial before the Roman political authorities. To get the religious leaders' intended verdict of death, there had to be a political trial, because while the religious authorities had the ability to try cases, they did not have the power to carry out sentences. And so both trials, as I said, had three sections. No gospel has all 6 phases of the 2 trials, but rather each gospel writer picks and chooses from the phases to create the emphasis that he wanted for his purposes. And so what Mark does is he just collapses these 2 trials with 6 phases each into just simply 2 trials. A religious trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, and the civil political trial before Pontius Pilate. I want to begin with the religious trial because that's where Jesus began, before Caiaphas, before the Sanhedrin, and pay close attention to some things that Mark says about this trial. Note where the meeting took place, notice when it took place, and notice how it took place. We pick up the story in Mark chapter 14, verses 53 and following. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, elders, and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and there he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony about him. We heard him say that I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another not made by man. Yet even then, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him as worthy of death. And then some began to spit on him, and they blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. Now skip over to verse 1 of chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priest with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. I asked you to notice where the meeting took place, when it took place, and how it took place, and that's because where it took place was illegal, when it took place was illegal, and how it took place was illegal. According to the Sanhedrin's own law, the place was illegal because the trial took place at the high priest Caiaphas' house. But Caiaphas' home was not the official meeting place of the Sanhedrin. The official meeting place was a part of the temple complex known as the Hall of Hewn Stones, and decisions of the Sanhedrin were not valid unless they were reached at this particular place. Likewise, the time of the meeting was illegal because the court was not allowed to meet at night, nor was it to meet during a feast, but yet this trial took place both at night and during the feast of Passover. But not only was the place and time illegal, so were the proceedings. When evidence was taken, witnesses were normally examined separately. Their evidence had to agree in every detail, but here we see these witnesses are all taken together, and the only witnesses that are there are all liars. All they wanted to do was to defame Jesus. And the group in verse 58 did what so many defamers do. They misquoted Jesus because they had misunderstood him, probably hearing what they wanted to hear instead of what Jesus actually said. Jesus never said he would tear down this man-made temple. The statement in question is actually recorded for us in the Gospel of John, and there Jesus had just cleared the temple of the money changers, and then the Jews come to him in John chapter 2, verses 18 through 21, and they demand of him, "What miraculous signs can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. See, defamation often comes from misquotations and misunderstandings that are maliciously twisted into lies or simply spread without getting the correct understanding. The defamer might try to cover himself or herself's tracks by saying, well, I thought. But here's the thing we can say to that. Did your parents ever say what my parents said to me when I would try to use the excuse, "I thought"? They would say, "Don't think." Now, other times I got in trouble for not thinking, but this is the kind of case where they would say, "Don't think." Don't think? No. Get the truth. Get the facts. Share the facts. Get accurate understanding. We often hear that what we want to hear, and if we present that as the truth, then we've committed defamation. But defaming witnesses, was not the only procedural problem. Furthermore, each individual member of the Sanhedrin, we're told, was supposed to give his verdict separately, beginning from the youngest and going to the oldest. And if the verdict was a verdict of death, then there had to be a day in between the verdict and the carrying out of the sentence so that there could be time for the court to have a change of mind in terms of mercy. And that was a good rule because sometimes you need to sleep on a big decision before you make it official, especially when it has to do with someone's life. But what do we see here? We find that these men condemned Jesus at night in probably a late night or early morning court session. They're basically up all night, and then their final decision is reached early in the morning when they were exhausted. And they sent Jesus directly to the Romans. And then heading up this whole kangaroo court was Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the spiritual leader of the nation, but he was ungodly. The way Caiaphas asked his question put Jesus under oath in verse 61, the end of 61, and that caused Jesus to have to answer in verse 62. Notice Caiaphas asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," Jesus said, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Some interesting things to note about this. There's more than I can really even mention right now, but the title Son of Man was messianic. It comes from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, which Jesus basically quotes here in his response. But claiming to be the Messiah was not really a capital offense, but likening yourself to God was a capital offense in the minds of the Sanhedrin. And that is what Jesus did, and he did it on purpose. Not only did he use the messianic title and quote Daniel 3:17 or 7:13 as if he was the fulfillment, but he also used the expression "I am" in a powerful way. In high school, I was on the mock trial team for our school because back then I wanted to be a lawyer, and it was actually mock trial that caused me not to want to be a lawyer. But in mock trial, you learned both sides of a case, and then you went to competition to present one or the other side of the cases. And our mock trial coach was a local attorney, and one of the things that he taught us that I do remember is that he said, never introduce yourself saying, "My name is," your name. Don't ever say, "My name is Stuart Holloway." You say, "I am Stuart Holloway." Because your name is not a label. Your name is who you are. And when you're meeting someone, you want to say who you are. Well, the same was for Jesus. Except you see, Jesus could stop after "I am," because that was his name. Those two words connect back to Exodus 3 when God revealed to Moses his covenantal name. Moses had asked God, well, suppose they ask me who sent me, what am I supposed to tell them your name is? And God says, tell them I am sent you. When Jesus was asked if he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, which was a way of referring to God without saying his name, Jesus replied, I am. And as that sunk in, then Jesus quoted the Daniel prophecy. Let me tell you, no one that night missed what Jesus was saying. His statement had punch. It had confidence. He didn't say, oh, my name is Jesus the Messiah. He said, I am. Jesus was the Messiah, and he was God in flesh. Now, this was blasphemy to the Sanhedrin, so that's why Caiaphas makes this grand display of tearing his clothes and saying, what more do we need? We have all the witnesses that we need because we're all witnesses to this blasphemy. And so they skipped a fair trial, and they rushed to judgment. However, while the fact that Jesus claimed to be God was blasphemy to the Sanhedrin and worthy of death, they couldn't carry out the sentence of death. Only Rome could do that. And Rome could care less that some Jewish lowlife had claimed to be God. And so the Sanhedrin had to cook up several accusations that made Jesus into a wannabe king that would be a threat to Rome. Now, it was a ridiculous charge, and the thing is, everybody knew it was ridiculous because the Jews rejected Caesar as their king and were as disloyal to Rome as they were accusing Jesus of being. And though the Jews expected a political Messiah, Jesus had never once claimed to be anything like that. Nevertheless, it was the trumped-up charge that they used. The trial before the Sanhedrin brought defamation to Jesus with vicious lies. And then to cap off their unruly trial, some of the religious leaders spit in Jesus' face. Now, think about that for just a moment. This was in a day before dental hygiene. There was no dental care. There was no toothpaste. There was no scope. I imagine everybody had really bad breath. And here these guys are spitting in Jesus' face. And that foul spit was running down his face and running down his beard. And another messianic prophecy, though, was Isaiah 50, verse 6, which said, I didn't hide my face from mocking or spitting. But spitting in Jesus' face wasn't enough. Some of the religious leaders added defamation with mocking jests to their slanderous arsenal. They blindfolded Jesus. They struck him with their fist. And then they said, prophesy. Who hit you? Come on, tell us. Which one of us hit you? Now, you see, there was some messianic idea that the Messiah could do that kind of thing. But this was not a test. This was a jest. And Jesus was not going to play games. But there's an irony in these mocking jests because the very men who wanted Jesus to prophesy because they thought he couldn't were actually fulfilling a prophecy Jesus had made himself. Because earlier in the Gospel of Mark, in verses 33 to 34, Jesus tells his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. They're just falling right into the plan. With their religious trial complete, the Sanhedrin then binds Jesus. They lead him to Pilate. And we pick up the story in chapter 15, verse 2, where Pilate asks, are you the king of the Jews? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, are you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. So having been handed this trumped-up charge of Jesus claiming to be the king of the Jews, Pilate turns to Jesus and just asks, well, are you? And Jesus' reply is interesting. It's rendered by different translations with slight variance. Some say it's the NIV, yes, it is as you say. Others, like the ESV, says more like, you've said so. The reply is really just 2 words in the original language, essentially, you say. So we have to think, how is Jesus saying this? It seems to me that Jesus is implying in his answer, look, man, whatever you say, because we both know this isn't true. Pilate knew this wasn't true. Jesus knew it wasn't true. The religious leaders knew it wasn't true. There was no need for Jesus to explain. And then the chief priests just accuse him of more stuff. Did you notice that? They accuse him of many things in verse 3 there, and just kind of hoping something will stick. And so again, Pilate asks Jesus, aren't you going to answer? I mean, they're accusing you of all these things. But Jesus is silent. He makes no defense. I think there are several reasons for that. The first is sometimes silence is more powerful than words. You see, sometimes silence can say things that words would never say. When someone says much in their defense, we kind of get into that conclusion that Queen Gertrude in Shakespeare's Hamlet reached, the lady doth protest too much, methinks, right? But when the unjustly accused are silent, when the defamed stand their ground with strength and faith, we think, maybe they're saying much without saying anything. And Jesus certainly was doing that. The second reason Jesus made no defense is Jesus knew it was pointless to do so. When you're in the hotbed of defamation, there is really no way out in that moment. No one wants to hear the truth. You might actually make things worse by trying to defend yourself. However, later, when the defamers have had their day, truth will have its day. Truth always prevails. And so Jesus was holding on to that because he knew where this was heading, which brings to the third reason that Jesus remained silent, is that he was in complete control of the situation. The Sanhedrin thought they were in control, but they were not. Jesus was in control. Everything was moving towards the cross and to the tomb. Jesus' silence was yet another fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah 53:7 predicted that Messiah would be silent when before his accusers. Now it's interesting that at times Jesus spoke when being silent would have helped his case, and at other times he was silent when speaking would have helped his case. But Mark says that Pilate was amazed at Jesus and his silence. Why? Because Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. But Pilate was afraid of the Jews. And so he ended up committing a different kind of defamation, which we'll call defamation through fearful placation. Pilate was no friend of the Jews, and the Jews were no friend of Pilate. He'd gotten off with a bad start with them some years before. His predecessors had been more accommodating of the religious traditions of the Jews, but Pilate had no use for the Jews. He felt Rome was far more important than any conquered people's traditions. He also treated nothing as sacred. When Pilate decided to build an aqueduct to Jerusalem to bring water, that was a good idea. But when he decided to pay for it with money out of the temple treasury, that was a bad idea. And it resulted in riots throughout the city. The tense relationship between the Jews and Pilate made this whole situation with Jesus tenuous. In fact, I think Pilate rolled his eyes when the Sanhedrin started shuffling in with their trumped up case. And so all he wanted to do was to get rid of these people as fast as possible. And so he came up with a plan and fell into their plan. Verse 6 and following, now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barnabas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising, and the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Well, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked. Crucify him, they cried. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Proverbs 16 verse 28 says, a perverse man stirs up dissension. Well, the Sanhedrin's action of stirring up the crowd to choose Barabbas instead of Jesus and to cry out for Jesus' crucifixion reveals their perversion. Leith Anderson reminds us that the whole situation was ridiculous because the Jews hated crucifixion. It was uncharacteristic for Jews to be shouting for anybody's crucifixion. And yet here the religious leaders are egging people on. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent, but he did nothing. Still, it's significant to note, and it's especially of significance for Mark's recipients who were living in Rome at the time, that the first Roman official who encountered anyone related to Christianity determined that the founder was innocent. You see, Pilate could have done something, but in doing nothing, he defamed Jesus through fearful placation. And then he hands Jesus over to the soldiers who once again defame him with mocking jests. Look at verses 16 and following. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and they spit on him. And falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to crucify him. Defamation with vicious lies. Defamation with fearful placation. And defamation with mocking jests. You know, it's interesting. We probably would not know the names Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate today had it not been for their ungodly condemnation of Jesus. Caiaphas was just one man in a family line who dominated the high priesthood for generations. But because he defamed Jesus, he's gone down in history as an evil man along with the Sanhedrin and the Roman soldiers and the crowd. Yet Jesus, even though they defamed him, was devoted to them. And Jesus was devoted to these evil people? Yeah. You see, Jesus wanted to make a way for them, even the vilest of sinners, to find salvation. He wanted a way for even the very people who crucified him to be able to be forgiven and redeemed and saved. Unfortunately, we have no indication that Caiaphas ever repented of what he did. We, of course, can't know about the rest of the members of the Sanhedrin, though we do know that both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were faithful to Jesus, but they probably weren't invited to the kangaroo court. And we don't know what the crowd eventually did. But there is an interesting tradition about Pontius Pilate. You see, while one tradition says that Pilate's career ended badly and that he committed suicide, another says that Pilate and his wife both became devoted Christians. The Egyptian Coptic Church has adopted that legend as truth. It holds both Pontius Pilate and his wife as saints. I mean, who would ever thought of Saint Pilate? Now, whether that legend is true or not, we can't know this side of heaven. We'll find out one day when we get to heaven, and if Pontius Pilate and his wife are there, we'll know it's true. But here's the thing. It could have been possible because Jesus died for all sinners. From the murderous religious leaders who punched him and spit in his face with their trumped up charges and their defaming, vicious lies, to Pilate, who defamed him with fearful placation, to the crowd and the soldiers who defamed him with mocking jests. They may have been defaming him, but he was devoted to them. Every step of the day, they were on his mind. Hanging on that cross, they were on his mind. Just as you and I were. Just as every person from the beginning of time to the end of time was. Every person who was a sinner, and that includes every person who has ever lived and ever will live, was on Jesus' mind. Jesus was innocent, but he was convicted. He was sinless, but he was crucified because he came to save sinners, including all of us. And so they defamed him. And it seemed like defamation had won the day. But really, the truth had. Because for generations and thousands of years, the prophecies had said what would happen to Messiah. And Jesus fulfilled every one of those prophecies. Jesus went to the cross because He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through Him. He had to make a way where there was no way. He loved the world so much that He came to the world on His Father's command so that if anyone would repent of their sins and believe in Him, they wouldn't have to perish, but they could have everlasting life because He loved us while we were still sinners. And He died for us while we were still sinners.